This week on Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast, we've had Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, giving his reaction to a possible ceasefire between Israel and Hamas.
This will come as a profound relief for the hostages and their families and the civilian population in Gaza.
Shadow Housing Secretary James Cleverly leaving the door open to becoming Mayor of London.
Watching London go wrong angers me enormously, but as I say, I'm not...
It sounds like you're thinking about it, though.
Look, I'd be stupid not to think about it, but as I say, my heart's in Essex.
And Chris Mason was asking the big questions at the Conservative Party conference.
Was it 4 or 5 in Westlife?
It varied.
Oh, did it?
So what have we learnt from all of that? We will discuss on this episode of Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the studio.
And it's Dharshini in the studio.
And please welcome Radio 4 royalty, although she'd never call herself that. It's Sarah Montague from The World at One. Hello.
Well, it is lovely to be here.
I'm just thinking, because this programme's on BBC One after question time, you will have been on air at 1 p.m. and 1 a.m. today. You've done the whole clock.
But because it's on television, a lot of people won't have a clue who I am until I speak. And then I hope that they recognise the voice.
When you were doing The World at One today, obviously it was still breaking news about the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. And we've done a podcast episode of Newscast about what we know now about that deal that people can listen to on BBC Sounds. And so we won't focus on the kind of like the minute by minute stuff just now. But it must have been an amazing unfolding kind of episode of The World at One today.
Well, it's amazing. When your job, as you will all, I think all of you probably say the same, when your job is to sort of breathe doom and gloom into people's ears and you feel conscious of it, to have a story where there is hope. We've all been around the block a bit. You can sort of be nervous about being excited about a story, but to wake up this morning and hear that news was just great. Wasn't it? It just lifts your spirits and...
Although I can't escape the feeling that we have been here before. Do you remember in January, There was a ceasefire and hostages were being released and then it broke down?
Exactly. And that actually, on The World as One at One, it was one of the things that we were trying to establish. What is different this time? Could we get to next week? You have all that first, the hostages release, and then you have a reversion. And actually what was astonishing is the confidence coming back from lots of people that the momentum this time is different. Although everybody, of course, had this big question mark over whether President Trump is going to stay the course and stay with it.
And Chris, if we look at British politics, the conflict has been felt so strongly in so many different areas of British political life.
It really has. It's had a profound effect, I think, hasn't it? Particularly on two communities, on Jews and on Muslims, but it's been a big part of the political conversation ever since October of a couple of years ago. We saw its expression in the general election campaign with some independent MPs elected specifically as a result of a campaign around Gaza. And we now see it in terms of the UK trying to play something of a diplomatic role in what comes next. So we've seen the Foreign Secretary heading to Paris for this meeting of other European foreign ministers and indeed some from the Middle East. And the thing that keeps getting mentioned to me, and of course any diplomatic mission will lean into the apparent role that it claims it has. And there's no dismissing, and the Prime Minister was explicit about the role of Donald Trump in all of this. But parallels are being drawn between the peace plan, the Trump peace plan, and the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland of 25 years ago. And of course, there are two central characters from then who are involved right now. So you have Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister, and his role in this board of peace in terms of what happens
if that's
Gaza.
Ever established.
If it's established, then let's see how that plays out. But nonetheless, his name is there in the mix. And then Jonathan Powell, who is the National Security Advisor in the current government, but was the Chief of Staff to Tony Blair back then and was heavily involved in the negotiations of the Good Friday Agreement. He was in conversations in Egypt in the last few days around trying to bring about what we're seeing coming about right now. So both in the diplomacy And then absolutely in the politics, and of course, it's most extreme, what we saw in Manchester just last week. It's been a staple, hasn't it? It's been a staple it sounds quite parochial in the grand scheme of things, but a staple of the political conversation over the last couple of years.
And of course, on every weekend on our streets, protests.
Yes.
Which, I mean, we have no knowledge of whether this is going to be enough to stop those, but it's been dividing society so much. So it'll be interesting to see, how things progress and what effect that has.
Well, yeah, because I just think it has left permanent scars on British politics just because there's this ceasefire agreement now and everyone's celebrating, and you can see the scenes in Hostage Square in Tel Aviv and the relief all across Israel and the relief in Gaza that the bombing will stop. It's like, actually, it doesn't just wipe the slate clean. Like, a lot of people have said a lot of things. And Chris, you alluded to the fact that it's the start of a process where Keir Starmer will have to make decisions about what he supports or what he criticises or what he pushes or what he tries to nudge along in the next few months.
Absolutely that. In the context of a conversation that brings out the strongest of passions. We saw that a couple of weeks ago with the government's decision to recognise a Palestinian state and the delicate language that both the Prime Minister and the President of the United States used. In fact, in response to the question I put to the two of them about that, given that we knew that the President and the Prime Minister had different instincts around that. So absolutely, that will continue. But as Sarah says, what will be interesting if, and of course it remains an if, something manages to hold, is there a proportionate, if you like, dialing down in the salience of the anger around so many of these issues in the UK, not least those protests that we've seen so frequently.
But one of the things, and obviously starting with the if this develops and, for example, journalists get into Gaza, there is, I think, there are going to be so many stories that come out that we haven't been able to cover. And to some extent, it will be a re-traumatising. So it will still run through and sort of provoke rage from people as they learn more about what's happened. And of course, we don't know the time scale of that. There will be tremendous push for journalists to be able to go into Gaza in the weeks ahead.
And also, I mean, it was interesting, Chris, a minute ago when you were talking about Tony Blair's potential role, because that's always been a sort of an aspect of this story that's made people go, kind of, really? It's been a sort of almost like fantastical. But I suppose it now comes into view as a real prospect that the former Prime Minister of this country will be completely integral to what happens in Gaza in the future.
Yes, and that will, of course, provoke a political reaction here, given that Tony Blair always does, but then particularly in the context of the Iraq War and also within the Labour movement. I was really struck, and again, excuse the parochial political point here. Sarah and I were both in Manchester. You were as well, Adam, weren't you, at the Conservative conference? And the Conservative Party is a party that reveres its electorally successful leaders. There was pictures of, and indeed the dresses of, Margaret Thatcher all over the exhibition hall in Manchester. It's because we're approaching the centenary of her birth. You would never see the equivalent at a Labour conference around Tony Blair, because he's incredibly divisive within the party that he very electorally successfully led. So, yeah, absolutely. If this Board of Peace comes about and he plays a prominent role, not only will that be provocative to some in the Middle East, and we've seen elements of that expressed already, but it will be within the UK too.
Okay, I mean, we voxed. You go out with your microphone and you're nobbling basically the delegates
also known as
at Labour.
talking. I love that we have to come up with our own name for it.
We
talking,
asked questions of delegates, but you can see, you're heading towards people, charging at them with your microphone, thinking, I am so sorry I'm doing this to you. And asked actually about the Tony Blair.
Oh, right, okay.
And it was so interesting to see the response, because there were so many people who were just very, very uncomfortable about it. And actually people who sort of said, look, he's a very good fixer. In fact, people who used to work with him say he's very capable of fixing things. But this does not look good. And actually, I interviewed the Palestinian Justice Affairs Minister on The World at One this week, Shahabil Al-Zaim, and he referred to... He just hated this idea of the Board of Peace. He referred to it, are they our masters and we their slaves? Because, as he said, it's not governance, it's a technocratic committee. And it's international outsiders. He was very rude about it. And actually, he's a very moderate man.
Which is a reminder that, okay, this bit of the process has been very hard, but all the bits that come after are even harder, which is why it's just so sort of contingent.
Yeah.
But as we were saying, it's nice to finally have something to be hopeful about, right? Because we've been here before,
Yep.
kind of, sort of, but it does feel like we've moved a step along further down the road, but there is going to be so much we're all discussing in the months to come.
And yeah, you can listen to the latest episode of Newscast, the podcast edition on BBC Sounds, where you'll hear me discussing some of the ins and outs of it with Lise Doucette and many others from the BBC as we try and get our heads around this massive story. Right, Chris, you mentioned party conference season, the Margaret Thatcher outfits in glass cases. It was a bit like going to a museum, wasn't it, when you arrived at Tory party conference? Because that was the first thing you were presented with, Margaret Thatcher's old outfits in these glass boxes. It was like going to the V&A, but like a weird version of it.
And it throws up a conversation that many Conservatives have had for a while, which is, whilst there is that distinction between a Conservative Party that will revere its electorally successful leaders in the way that Labour, certainly around Tony Blair, doesn't do, to what extent is it useful to the contemporary Conservative Party to be as reverent or as looking at, just looking at through the rearview mirror of somebody who left office 35 years ago. And I've had senior Conservatives say to me there's a temptation to do, as they described it, karaoke Thatcherism, which is a proud reverence for a party's successful leader, but how useful is that when looking at the problems of the 2020s?
Okay, am I allowed to ask a question and chip in? Because I'm
Please do.
curious if that was also part of what the Conservative Party was trying to do, which is a sort of, it's almost like to shore up the right against the threat from Reform UK.
I think it's a bit of that. And as I say, there is also the marking of the centenary, which I think is why those dresses were there and that particular thing. But you will often see at Conservative Party conferences a reverence, particularly around Thatcher. There was an AI Churchill as well, by the way, in that.
Oh, I missed that. I saw it on social media.
An AI Churchill.
What did he do?
Well, he talked.
Did you chat to him?
We did some filming with him.
Right.
It was, unlike when you're chasing around, of course, the AI Churchill couldn't say no. So we just, yeah. So there was a Disraeli theatre, and so that sort of reverence.
I mean, they're always into their heritage, the Tories, aren't they? They always are.
But I think there is an element of reminding the party, which is currently in a desperate situation, really, in the opinion polls and obviously the general election last year, of their heritage and electoral success, and that they have ridden the ebbs and flows of political tides in the past, and so they hope they can do again when up against an insurgency and an upstart outfit that is coming from scratch. So I think there's a bit of that going on as well.
And Dharshini, in the hall yesterday in Manchester, there was a moment of genuine excitement during Kemi Badenoch's speech because the big announcement hadn't leaked, and she actually built the tension up quite well, and you could hear the oohs and ahs, and she's like, and then we will scrap stamp duty.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the terms and conditions come in, because it would be stamp duty in England. And Northern Ireland, because it's devolved in Scotland and Wales. Then, of course, the economics brains get their heads around what it really means and what it costs and who it helps.
Well, those of us not privileged enough to be looking at Margaret Thatcher's dresses or in the hall, I actually had my head in my hands, because I went, hang on a minute, your stamp duty is meant to bring in over 26 billion pounds by the end of this decade. So where are they finding all this money? And then you start looking at the small print and going, discard anybody who is not resident in the UK. Only if it's your first home does this apply. And then it starts looking like a very different beast indeed. And obviously hugely popular with a lot of people. But then you actually look at some more of the fine print, and again, I feel like you're talking about doom and gloom, and I feel like I'm going to be that person and go, actually it's not all that. But if you look at stamp duty and who pays it and how much they pay, 4% of transactions are homes worth over £1 million. But because it's a very progressive tax, it brings in over that particular tax.
I.e., the more expensive the house, there's different rates for different prices of houses.
Yeah. So the more basically, the higher up the income scale you are, the more you're paying in. And it means that over half of stamp duty revenue comes in from those buying properties worth over $1 million. So in other words, who does this really benefit, and how much does it really help that first-time buyer who's trying to...
The thing is, though, when one of the big issues of our time is the gap between people's earnings and the affordability of homes, I take your point about the progressive nature of it, but it'd still have a pretty significant effect for people on more modest incomes seeking what people would regard as sort of normal homes.
Yeah, I mean, particularly outside London and the southeast, where there is still that huge affordability gap for getting on the ladder, it could make a difference. But then you have this issue of greater demand out there, which pushes up house prices, right? So the answer is...
So this could be inflationary.
So it could be inflationary. So really, the thing you really want to do is build more homes. And if you can't do that, how do you stop it becoming inflationary and prices getting further out of reach? You find a new form of property tax. Nobody wants to talk about that, really, do they?
Oh, this was, it was interesting, Sarah, in the actual conference, Kemi Badenoch sold this half as a tax cut, but also half as a way of just freeing up the housing market so that people in houses that are too big for them and they want to downsize could sell, and it's a better prospect now.
I mean, that is what I was wondering, actually, is about, because it's, as you say, it's sort of removing supposedly some of the friction in the market, and it would benefit builders and decorators and things like that. That's very much how she pitched it.
Yeah, totally. Estate agents. Had a lot of excited estate agents filling my inbox going, do you want a comment from us? And that's fine. No, you're happy. But on the other hand, renters, it may not make that much difference for them, because landlords, you're buying a second home, still have to pay stamp duty. You're going to pass it on to people renting from you. But no, it was genuinely an exciting moment, though, because, senior sort of shadow cabinet ministers have been saying to me, we're in listening mode ahead of this. And now they seem to be in activist mode, if you can put it that way. And then we've suddenly got a policy debate happening in real time, which we haven't had for ages in this kind of way.
From the Conservatives.
No.
One person it definitely did benefit, forget whether it's rich homeowners or people in the southeast or not, Kemi Badenoch instantly benefited her.
Yeah, yes, it did, and I think it was her standout moment of her leadership so far. Really, now she's had a rough old time. I mean, it's always difficult being leader of the opposition, and it's particularly if you're leading a party that's just been tonked at a general election. But the chat about her and her leadership has been pretty vicious, and a lot of it's been quite personal as well. And obviously, your Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, has been churning out videos left, right and centre, not exclusively about the justice system as well. And, if you're a party of the scale and heritage of the Conservatives and you're in the teens in the opinion polls, if you're the leader, you are in trouble. That's just guaranteed. And that fundamental has not changed. It's not going to change overnight. But it is also true that some of her internal sceptics were pleasantly surprised by what they heard, both in terms of her performance. She came across as confident. She came across like she was enjoying herself.
She laughed quite a lot.
Yeah, she did, and publicly, we've not heard the Kemi Badenoch laugh much.
Yeah, I thought let's dwell on that for a second, because it's interesting in how many in the write-ups in the papers from the columnists you hear them saying, "Oh yeah, she laughed." Why is it such a big deal that Kemi Badenoch giggled as a seasoned observer of politicians?
Because she's quite often, when you're interviewing people, you're wanting to show, you're going to do the hard stuff, but you're also wanting to show the sort of human side. And usually as a journalist, you try to give a moment to a politician, don't you, Chris?
Yeah, to try and allow them to do that.
Yeah, to here's a bit of space for you to show that you're human and, maybe people can relate to you. And she's been quite sort of, I don't know, it's a bit harsh saying uptight, but
and also
she was almost giggling. I mean, it was sort of...
And also some of the examples of those things she's given in the past are things like in the interview with Amal Rajan, which she said, "Oh yeah, I called out somebody for cheating in my exams in school." And you're like, maybe that's not the kind of personal colour you want to really be throwing out there to introduce yourself to the country.
But I think she was responding to the mood in the hall, because I think you were in there the whole time.
Yeah.
I wasn't in there.
You had work to make.
But I did pop in, because it's always different in the hall,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah.
And I just wanted to get that sense to pick up from, we'd obviously heard about the leadership thing, and I popped in, and I happened to be there just at the moment that was being announced. And I heard, in the build-up as well. And she was her laugh was almost in response to the feeling that she was getting from the hall.
Yeah, it was.
Which I think was, and it's what actually a lot of those you will have heard as well, people sort of saying she needs to build her confidence, and that she is building her confidence.
And Dharshini, there was the return of something from the distant past, the deficit. Talking about the deficit,
Yes.
which we talked about in the 2010s. We talked about 900 times a day.
Well, we talk about it all the time, Adam.
We do.
We do, but it's a niche thing, I know.
Yeah.
No, the deficit, but I think it goes bigger than that, because obviously we have this new golden rule that she'd like to introduce, which would mean that half the money that she manages to net, she will save, and half will give back to us as treats or other tax cuts or, some kind of other incentive. All of which hinges on actually finding that money, that 47 billion that she said she's going to somehow save. And you look at the numbers and the plans and the timings, and it feels a little bit shaky. But part that one aside, as you say, it brought back to this idea of can the Conservatives be the party of sound money once again? But actually, I think it sort of shone the spotlight on a wider subject because a lot of people said to me, how does this compare with Rachel Reeves' plans? Right. And I said, it's kind of apples and pears because it all hinges on how successful she is on actually making some savings. But beyond that, this is kind of cast a spotlight on how big should the state be? Do we want the state to look like a different thing? What do you want in return for your taxes? What are your preferences here? Would you rather have tax cuts and we have a leaner state, even if, and some of the plans that were talked about could easily mean a new age of austerity, right? So are you prepared to sort of sacrifice some of the public services in return for getting this back? And that's not really a debate we've had for a while.
Well, for example, one of the savings that the Conservatives have penciled in into their imaginary budget, if they were the government now, which they're not, is £23 billion from the welfare system, which is very easily said, but much harder delivered.
As Keir Starmer would be the first to tell you, having tried and failed to achieve a far smaller.
Yeah, £5 billion.
A far smaller shaving. I mean, the argument the Conservatives are making, particularly around welfare, is that the ballooning cost of it in the post-COVID era is one where you could make significant savings and you'd be going back to where things were in 2019, 2020, rather than necessarily to a lower level than that. But it's a big thing to try and do. Now, the argument that Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, makes is that we simply have to do it as a country. But we've seen how Labour have struggled. Now, I think Labour in particular always face a particular challenge. It's the nature of their heritage as a movement around cuts to welfare. But any government that manages to assemble a majority, the breadth that would require would likely mean that they would feel the heat of it themselves too.
Back to your point, Dharshini, about comparing apples and pears and what Rachel Reeves is doing and what Mel Stride is doing here, the Shadow Chancellor. Yeah, this golden rule is a rule of thumb about what to do with money you've saved. Yeah. That is not the same as how quickly you would eliminate the deficit or how quickly you would get down government borrowing. The Tories will have to come back and come up with their versions of those.
Yeah, totally. And, I used to work in bond markets and they, as you know, have got, quite keen on keeping a close eye on all of this. And the idea is that, Kemi says if we're the party of sound money, then we can bring down borrowing and therefore borrowing costs. But as you say, there's no framework for actually saying, no, this is the limit we're looking for. It's just saying, actually, if we manage to save 50p, we'll put 25p of that towards... But it's really uncertain. So I'm not sure it's necessarily more credible, put it that way.
Except the interesting thing is from the polls, the Conservatives, and this by a number of polls, are doing better, slightly better than the Liz Truss time. But that's better on most economic measures than Labour or Reform. Yeah. Which is why they're going on to this territory, isn't it? I mean, it seems extraordinary, but I guess it's a reflection of how, lacking in credibility anybody is on the economy.
Yeah, and they see that differential and they're wanting to lean into that differential between Reform and Labour. And how do they articulate that rhetorically? They say Labour and Reform are sort of incontinent when it comes to spending public money, and the Conservatives wouldn't be. That's the basic gist of it. And I think and there's so many specifics that they've not got to, but I think at the moment they just want to sort of paint in fairly broad colours about roughly where they are. And certainly speaking to Conservative activists yesterday, they were just delighted to finally have stuff they can talk about, which they've hurried along a little bit. Now, Kemi Badenoch's argument has always been you don't make announcements, you come up with policies. She regards sort of others as being very flippant around spraying around a thought. She's having a bit of a pop at Nigel Farage there, but she's also having a pop at the government as well, spraying around an idea that isn't really thought through. And she believes, and she would say this, wouldn't she? But she does the hard thinking first and then comes out with the policy. But some in the party have been desperate to have something to say because they feel they've been absent and that has contributed to Nigel Farage's rise.
Dharshini, one of the things that has surprised me about lots of the party conferences this year is people haven't really talked about the cost of living. But yet you chat to actual people that you know and your friends and your relatives and colleagues, and actually the thing that comes up is how expensive the supermarket is.
Yeah.
And hardly any politicians addressed that this conference season.
And that is, I'm afraid to say, the elephant in the room, because when you talk to people, when you look at numbers, and you look at spreadsheets and charts and the rest of it, the thing that's holding people back at the moment, incomes are rising faster than inflation, but people are really scared to spend because they're not sure where inflation is going to go next. They are, and it's a technical term, they are scarred by the inflation experience of the last 2 years. In fact, talking to one economist who said, in the last couple of years, if you look at what's happened to inflation, people have experienced the equivalent of 12 years of inflation if you compare it to the average in preceding years. So you can see why people are
12
really...
in just the last couple
in just the last couple of years. If you just look at a couple of years that are around the time of the Ukraine invasion. So you can see why people are going, well, actually, I'm not about to put my money out there. Interestingly enough, though, when we talk about the budget and the noises you kind of tend to hear, did you notice the Chancellor talking about we will do something to help with the cost of living? And the emphasis seems to have shifted slightly away from saying growth, 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 to actually this is the problem we have to tackle. So I don't think it's gone away. It's just that no one's got the easy answers right now.
Well, yeah, Chris, I'm just thinking back to last week's episode of Newscast where Professor Jane Green, the polling expert, was sat in the studio and she's like, oh yeah, Labour keep talking about economic growth, but no one really knows what economic growth is because people don't experience economic growth in their life. And that's really stuck with me.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation we could have about so often the gap between political language and then the lived experience of, never mind economic growth. It's the cost of a chicken in the supermarket freezer or whatever, isn't it? That's the reality of it, relative to where it was a couple of years ago, and relative to how much money you're earning every week or every month. And I think Labour, who have gone through various iterations of communication strategy and strategists in the last year and a bit, are latching onto that, and I think trying to humanise their language around this sort of stuff and just talk in a way that people would relate to, as opposed to in that kind of macroeconomic way, which matters, of course it matters, but is not how people feel the economy day to day.
Just to close off our conversation about party conference season, there's still some more to go. So Plaid Cymru, Party of Wales, they're meeting right now as we speak. They're probably in a bar right now singing some Plaid Cymru songs. And then you're going to the SNP.
Yeah, going to Aberdeen in a couple of days' time for their conference ahead of what are going to be fascinating elections in Scotland for the SNP and others, and in Wales for Plaid and others, and then, of course, in lots of parts of England as well next May. Of course, Westminster always obsesses about elections, and all politicians always obsess about elections. But next May's do feel sort of outsized, and it's only October.
7 months to go.
Yeah. It just feels outsized for those two parties we just mentioned, SNP and Plaid, but also for Kemi Badenoch and for Keir Starmer, potentially still existential for them both. And then, of course, yes, for Nigel Farage and Reform and the Lib Dems and all of the others.
In terms of other things that have been happening today, as we're recording on Thursday, Chris, Keir Starmer will be heading back from India because he went on a big trade mission. Although this was to sort of re-announce the trade deal that's already been done with India and is getting sort of implemented bit by bit.
Yes, so he was doing the thing that prime ministers like to do, which is to take very transparently and visually a plane load of business leaders, even to the extent of posing on the tarmac with them all as they sort of come down the steps slightly bedraggled.
And he did the in-flight announcement on the plane, didn't he?
Did he?
Yes.
He actually looked a little bit embarrassed doing it. I don't think he was loving it.
Yeah,
he was in the cockpit with the intercom. Yeah. Chicken or beef?
What really unnerved me.
He's a vegetarian, so he's something else.
I was going to say,
As is much of India.
True. There were 5 types of lentils apparently on the menu today, which really intrigued me. But no, what really unnerved me about that announcement is apparently he ended by saying, "Have a safe flight," which sounds a little bit threatening.
Or like he was in charge. I don't think he was actually at the controls. Now, Sarah, World at One celebrating its 60th anniversary.
Indeed.
And you've been raiding the archive.
We have. We've even, the slight problem, there's so much news. We've got so much amazing archive that one of my colleagues keeps going, oh my God, listen to what I found. And he's coming up with stuff. And we had somebody even the other day contact us and say, why aren't you playing this? I remember when I was a producer and we couldn't find it. So they ended up delivering a cassette tape of Richard Burton talking to Bill Turnbull, which we will get on air at some point.
Wow.
And it was the last interview that Richard Burton did.
Well, thank you very much for coming on and talking on tonight's Newscast.
Lovely. Joy to be here.
Thank you. Dharshini, great to see you too.
Thank you.
Thanks to you too, Chris.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for watching this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.